Hi, I'm Cindy Ranzik. I'm the curator here at the Santa Maria Valley Historical Society, and we're partnering here in October with the city of Santa Maria to discuss history in the cemetery. I'm sitting in an old kitchen here in the museum at the old Blockman table that would have been sitting in their kitchen back in the early 1900s to talk about what you might find out at our local cemetery and how it relates to the city and to the museum here itself. One of the things we wanted to talk about was some of the Civil War veterans. We just passed the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, and of course, one of the favorite presidents is Abraham Lincoln. So we thought we'd share some of the connections here at the city of Santa Maria with the cemetery and with folks who are out in the cemetery who were related to the Civil War. A lot of the veterans from the Civil War came here during post-Reconstruction to start the city of Santa Maria, looking for a new start and a way to begin a new life, including some of our forefathers and their families as they arrived here. Other folks out there are about 44, 40 of which are Union officers or Union soldiers, and another 4 which were actually Confederates. So most of our history does circle around the North. However, those 4 other gentlemen that were Confederates were often included in meetings of the GAR, which we'll talk about a little more, which was the Grand Army of the Republic, which was our first kind of veterans group. These were the veterans of the Civil War, and they liked to gather and to consider different things. There was also a women's group which met and installed the flagpole out at the cemetery. So as we look at the history of our cemetery, we'll also be talking about the history of our people and all the great things that they did and the ways they commemorated their history and their timeline.
So this is the location for Mr. Alvin Cox. This was our first mayor here in Santa Maria. So we're pretty excited about him. He was also a Civil War veteran, and like I remarked before, you can't always tell from looking who's done what or what they've done. But one of the clues sometimes is their birth date. And one of the wonderful things about when you're doing genealogy is it's always great to find someone's headstone. There's actually a whole group places you can search called Find a Grave. And in Find a Grave, those folks are all volunteers, and they go around making pictures of all the different headstones so that we can find clues to our ancestry. And like I said, his birth date is my clue that he was a Civil War veteran, and then I can do more research, look him up and find out exactly what he did and where he was. And in this particular case, he was an orderly from Missouri during the American Civil War. But most importantly, this was our first mayor. This is a Civil War headstone. You might ask yourself, why does it look so new? Well, that would be because it is relatively new. It's only a couple of years old. The federal government will provide a headstone for any veteran. The Sons of the Confederacy here locally applied for William Miles to have his headstone emplaced, and they made that application, and the federal government agreed to do the headstone. So you can still recognize different folks, and sometimes you can get headstones replaced. That's why they'll see different ages of the headstones. But veterans are entitled. It's a little unusual for a Confederate soldier to receive a headstone, so oftentimes the Sons of the Confederacy or other groups associated with them will be the ones providing the headstones as opposed to the government, because obviously the Confederacy no longer exists. The headstones are slightly different. They don't contain the same images or imagery, but this one does bear the Southern Cross, and so that's how we know this gentleman was in the Confederate Army for the Confederate States in his timeline. Okay, so we're at the gravesite of Joseph Thornburg at this moment. Now, he was a Civil War veteran, but he doesn't have a Civil War headstone. But one of the ways you can know that he served during the Civil War is because of the star over here. This is it says Civil War veteran on it, and if you look across the cemetery, you'll see other stars, and some of them have GAR on it, which stood for Grand Army of the Republic, which was a veterans group that gathered after the war, much like the American Legion does today, and to talk about their war experiences and to recognize each other in informal settings. Some of them wore pins, and there were medals, but the star in the cemetery is a big clue that the headstone that you're looking at, that person probably served in the American Civil War.
This is an old tintype from the Civil War. This picture was taken of Joseph Thornburg. You can see that he's holding his rifle and that he's a Union soldier. And you can also see that he had a very long bayonet on there, which is very similar to this one. This was also a Union bayonet. In the Civil War, battle was quite personal a lot of times. Weapons didn't fire multiple times like they do now, so after the volleys were exchanged, a lot of times bayonets were fixed and battle became very personal. This is the Liberty Band of Central City, 1880. We're kind of focused on it because in this photo you can see Jesse Thornburg, who was the son of John Thornburg and a veteran of the Civil War. Jesse was a drummer, as you can see, and we have a lot of different artifacts from Jesse's time in the Civil War, both his discharge paper from the war and his drumsticks, which the family donated to the Historical Society. As a drummer, Jesse kind of had two roles. The drummer gave orders to all of the soldiers. They were relayed from the commanders, and so the drum kind of told all the guys what to do in the battle, much like the bugler did. And in this particular case, Jesse, as a drummer, would also have been responsible for moving casualties from the field, from both sides. A lot of times, the drummers were also the litter bearers, and they would remove the wounded from the battlefield, and they weren't necessarily only removing their own wounded. They pretty much removed all of the wounded from the battlefield. In some ways, it's kind of indicative of the fact that they were all really brothers.
Okay, so now we're at Ormond Paulding's gravesite. He's a very fascinating fellow, also a Civil War veteran, but he was also a doctor. And kind of what inspired him to become a doctor was his experience in the Civil War. He was quite young in the Civil War, in his teens, a teen soldier. A lot of veterans in the Civil War were teen soldiers. It was considered the boys' war because there was a lot of patriotism involved, and a lot of young men joined up and went out to fight, and Paulding was one of those young boys. And so he learned and saw so much during the Civil War, he decided he wanted to become a doctor, and he did. And they, after the war, obviously he went to medical school, and eventually they wound up out here in the Santa Maria area. And so his headstone's very interesting because he's a twofer. So there's information on both sides of his headstone. It's also kind of interesting because he was originally from Syria, specifically Damascus. So his story is pretty big. He actually served from Ohio during the Civil War. So after he'd done the Civil War and he went to medical school, his lifetime stretched far enough that he actually became able to be a doctor in World War I. So you can imagine he covered a lot of the historical timeline. He was an old, just as he was a boy in the Civil War, he was an old man in World War I. So he did mostly medical work behind the lines. But over here next to him, we'll give you a look at his daughter, who also served with the American Expeditionary Force during World War I as an Army nurse. So this is Mary Paulding, the daughter of Dr. Paulding. And like I said, she became a nurse during World War I and traveled quite extensively. We have a lot of pictures of her at the Historical Society we can share with you of her exploits. She actually took a lot of pictures of herself while she was traveling and serving as a nurse during World War I. She was also a twin, and while her sister didn't serve in the war, they were very close and spent quite a lot of time together. And in the cemetery, they're still spending quite a lot of time here together. So we have Mary here and Christine here. So one of the things you always find in a cemetery is a flagpole. In this particular case, this one was sponsored by the Women's Relief Corps, which was the women's auxiliary of the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic. So they were the widows and wives of Civil War veterans and lost heroes. And they sponsored the flagpole here in our cemetery. This is a great place to start learning about the Civil War here and how it relates to Santa Maria. And this is a great visual path here at the cemetery because you can see they're pretty easy to find their headstones. So if you don't have our book, which gives you a detailed look at where all of the different headstones are, it's easy to spot them by using the stars that you see. You can spot them that way. And a lot of the headstones have the traditional military cut that indicate that they are part of the Civil War, which will name their state of service and other specific things. But a lot of our forefathers were part of the Civil War, either as parents or specifically as soldiers. So it's kind of a fascinating look at the Civil War here in Santa Maria, considering not many people think California had a very big footprint on that.